Wonderful or supernatural events are not so uncommon. Rather, they are irregular in their incidence. Thus, there may be not one marvel to speak of in a century. And then, often enough, comes a plentiful crop of them. Comets blaze in the sky, eclipses frighten nature, meteors fall in rain, monsters of all sorts swarm suddenly upon the earth, while mermaids and sirens beguile, and sea serpents engulf every passing ship, and terrible cataclysms beset humanity. But the strange event which I shall here relate came alone, unsupported, without companions, into a hostile world, and for that very reason claimed little of the general attention of mankind. For the sudden changing of Mrs. Tebrick into a vixen is an established fact, which we may attempt to account for as we will. But here I will confine myself to an exact narrative of the event and all that followed on it. Mrs. Tebrick's maiden name was certainly Fox, and it is possible that such a miracle happening before, the family may have gained their name as a sobriquet on that account. They were an ancient family, and have had their seat at Tangley Hall time out of mind. It is also true that there was a half-tame fox once upon a time chained up at Tangley Hall in the inner yard, and I have heard many speculative wiseacres in the public houses turn that to great account. Sylvia was married in the year 1879 to Mr. Richard Tebrick after a short courtship, and went to live after their honeymoon at Rylands near Stokoe, Oxon. The marriage was a very happy one. On one of the first days of the year, 1880, in the early afternoon, husband and wife went for a walk in the copse on the little hill above Rylands. While they were walking, they heard the hounds, and later the huntsman's horn in the distance. Hearing the hunt, Mr. Tebrick quickened his pace, so as to reach the edge of the copse, where they might get a good view of the hounds if they came that way. His wife hung back, and he, holding her hand, began almost to drag her. Before they gained the edge of the copse, she suddenly snatched her hand away. Where his wife had been the moment before was a small fox. It looked at him very beseechingly, advanced towards him a pace or two, and he saw at once that his wife was looking at him from the animal's eyes. So that with his gazing on her and knowing her well, even in such a shape, yet asking himself at every moment, "Can it be she? Am I not dreaming?" and her beseechingly, and lastly fawning on him and seeming to tell him it was she indeed, they came at last together. Richard waited till it was quite dark, that he might the better bring her into her own house without being seen, and buttoned her inside his top-coat, nay, even in his passion tearing open his waistcoat and his shirt, that she might lie the closer to his heart. For, when we are overcome with the greatest sorrow, we act not like men or women, but like children, whose comfort in all their troubles is to press themselves against their mother's breast, or, if she be not there, to hold each other tight in one another's arms. Having got her into the house, the next thing he thought of was to hide her. He carried her to the bedroom in his arms, and then went downstairs again. Richard, returning with a tray of tea and bread, for the first moment thought the room was empty, and his vixen got away, for he could see no sign of her anywhere. But after a moment he saw something stirring in a corner of the room, and then, behold, she came forth, dragging her dressing-gown, into which she had somehow struggled. Richard began to blame himself heartily, because he had not guessed that his wife would not like to go naked, notwithstanding the shape she was in. Nothing could satisfy him then till he had clothed her suitably, bringing her dresses from the wardrobe for her to choose. At last he picked out a little dressing jacket that she was fond of wearing sometimes in the mornings. The short sleeves sat very well on her now. They then took tea together, she very delicately drinking from a saucer and taking bread and butter from his hands. All this showed him, or so he thought, that his wife was still herself. There was so little wildness in her demeanour and so much delicacy and decency, especially in her not wishing to run naked, that he was very much comforted, and began to fancy they could be happy enough if they could escape the world and live always alone. From this too sanguine dream he was aroused by hearing the dogs. For ever since he had come in with his vixen, they had been whining, barking, and growling, and all, as he knew, because there was a fox within doors, and they would kill it. So with that morning there began what was now to be their ordinary life together. He would get up when it was broad day, and first thing light the fire downstairs and cook the breakfast. Then brush his wife, sponge her with a damp sponge, then brush her again. When she was dressed, he carried her downstairs, and they had their breakfast together, she sitting up to table with him, drinking her saucer of tea and taking her food from him. She was still fond of the same food that she had been used to before her transformation, a lightly boiled egg or slice of ham, a piece of buttered toast or two, with a little quince and apple jam. What helped most to make living with her bearable for him was that she understood him perfectly. Yes, every word he said, and though she was dumb, she expressed herself very fluently by looks and signs, though never by voice. Thus he frequently conversed with her, telling her all his thoughts and hiding nothing from her. And this the more readily because he was very quick to catch her meaning and her answers. Anyone seeing them would have sworn that they were lovers, so passionately did each look on the other. This tenderness never failed to delight him, for it showed she was still his wife, buried as it were in the carcass of a beast, but with a woman's soul. This encouraged him so much that he debated with himself whether he should not read aloud to her, as he often had done formerly. At last, since he could find no reason against it, he went to the shelf and fetched down a book which he had begun to read aloud to her a few weeks before. "Good God! What is now to become of me? My feet benumbed by midnight wanderings through the heaviest dews that ever fell, my wig and my linen dripping with the hoar-frost dissolving on them, day but just breaking." While he read, he was conscious of holding her attention. Then, after a few pages, the story claimed all his, so that he read on for about half an hour without looking at her. When he did so, he saw that she was not listening to him, but was watching something with strange eagerness. Such a fixed, intent look was on her face that he was alarmed and sought the cause of it. With this spell of fine weather, it was but natural that Mr. Tabrick should think of taking his vixen out of doors. This was something he had not yet done, both because of the damp, rainy weather up till then, and because the mere notion of taking her out filled him with alarm. But he resolved to take her, though with full precautions. That is, he left the house door open so that in case of need she could beat a swift retreat. Then he took his gun under his arm, and lastly he had her well wrapped up in a little fur jacket, lest she should take cold. He would have carried her further, but that she delicately disengaged herself from his arms and looked at him very expressively to say that she would go by herself. They walked round the garden and down to the pond, where there were ornamental waterfowl, teal, widgeon, and mandarin ducks, and seeing these again gave her great pleasure. They had always been her favorites, and now she was so overjoyed to see them that she behaved with very little of her usual self-restraint. But when they got within doors, here the tears stood suddenly in his eyes, and he wept, paying no heed to her, until presently he was aroused by her nudging him gently from behind his legs toward the parlor. Mr. Tebrick sat silently, looking out of the window for some time. Then he took out his pocket-book. In it there was a photograph of his wife, taken soon after their wedding. Now he gazed and gazed upon those familiar features, and now he lifted his head and looked at the animal before him. He laughed then, bitterly, the first and last time, for that matter, that Mr. Tebrick ever laughed at his wife's transformation, for he was not very humorous. But this laugh was sour and painful to him. Then he tore up the photograph into little pieces and scattered them out of the window, saying to himself, "Memories will not help me here." And turning to the vixen, he saw that she was already done eating and proudly licking her chops. There came to him then a thought that was very disagreeable to him, namely, whether he dare trust his wife alone with any bird, or she would kill it. Yet she was still in many ways so much more woman than fox. That night she would not sleep with him, neither in the bed nor on it, so that he was forced to let her curl herself up on the floor. But neither would she sleep there, for several times she woke him by trotting around the room. And once, when he had got sound sleep, by springing on the bed and then off it, so that he woke with a violent start and cried out, but got no answer either, except hearing her trotting around and round the room. Thus he spent what was, perhaps, the most miserable night of his existence. In the morning she was still restless, and was reluctant to let him wash and brush her, and appeared to dislike being scented, but as it were to bear with it for his sake. "Are you not ashamed, Sylvia, to be such a madcap, such a wicked hoyden?" It was then that Mr. Tebrick resolved to put a project into execution that would show him, so he thought, whether he had a wife or only a wild vixen in his house. In the garden he gathered together a nosegay of snowdrops, those being all the flowers he could find, and then going into the village of Stokoe, bought a Dutch rabbit, that is a black and white one, from a man there who kept them. At this she ran up very prettily, and never giving as much as one glance at the rabbit, which had hopped out of its basket, she began to thank him for the flowers. Indeed, she seemed indefatigable in showing her gratitude, smelt them, stood a little way off looking at them, then thanked him again. Mr. Tebrick, and this was all part of his plan, then went to find a vase and some water for them, but left the flowers beside her. He stopped away 5 minutes, timing it by his watch and listening very intently, but never heard the rabbit squeak. What a horrid shambles was spread before his eyes! Blood on the carpet, blood on the armchairs and antimacassars. Even a little blood spurtled onto the wall, and what was worse, Mrs. Tebrick tearing and growling over a piece of the skin and the legs, for she had eaten up all the rest of it. "Oh, Sylvia, does not this butchery and eating of raw meat and rabbit's fur disgust you? Are you a monster in your soul as well as in your body? Have you forgotten what it is to be a woman?" Go, poor bird, fly from this wretched house while you still may remember your mistress, who fed you from her coral lips. You are not a fit plaything for her now. Farewell, poor bird. Farewell.